This analysis examines the escalating confrontation between Donald Trump and the Federal Reserve, a conflict that goes far beyond politics. It directly affects interest rates, access to money, banking freedom, and financial sovereignty for ordinary people. This confrontation exists within the broader structure of modern central banking, regulatory influence, and the growing tension between centralized financial control and decentralized financial infrastructure. Trump's repeated public statements, legal positioning, and policy stances indicate a deliberate challenge to the Federal Reserve's authority, legitimacy, and close relationship with major financial institutions. This is not rhetorical criticism alone. It is a sustained effort to question the institutional framework that governs monetary power in the United States. To understand this conflict, it is necessary to understand how the Federal Reserve operates. The Fed functions as a central bank with public authority while providing structural benefits to private financial institutions. It regulates major banks while simultaneously paying them interest on reserve balances. It creates money digitally and lends it into the system at interest. Although it operates with political independence, direct accountability remains limited. This structure gives the Federal Reserve extraordinary influence over credit availability, interest rates, liquidity, and access to the financial system itself. Trump's opposition to the Federal Reserve is not new. During his presidency, he openly criticized Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell and accused the Fed of restricting economic growth through interest rate decisions. He repeatedly questioned the wisdom and independence of central bank policy. These actions broke long-standing political norms, signaling a willingness to confront the central bank publicly rather than defer to it as an untouchable institution. The debate intensified following the January 6th period, when several Trump-linked accounts were closed by major banks, including J.P. Morgan Chase. Large banks operate under extensive Federal Reserve oversight, where expectations are often set implicitly rather than through direct instruction. Banks benefit financially from compliance through mechanisms such as interest on reserves. This creates an environment where reputational or political risk can lead to exclusion from banking services without explicit orders. Financial access can therefore be influenced indirectly through regulatory pressure rather than direct legal action. One of the core criticisms centers on the interest on reserves system. Ordinary depositors receive minimal interest on their savings, often fractions of a percent. Banks place those same funds at the Federal Reserve and receive significantly higher, risk-free returns. Citizens are legally barred from accessing the Federal Reserve directly. In practical terms, this means the banking system profits from money created by policy, while households absorb the cost through inflation, weak savings returns, and reduced purchasing power. Critics argue this structure concentrates financial benefit and power within a narrow institutional layer. This conflict also intersects with the regulatory treatment of cryptocurrencies and digital assets. Regulators increasingly restrict idle yield on stablecoins and digital balances, encouraging circulation rather than passive holding. Traditional exchanges rely heavily on parked capital for leverage and control, while decentralized finance challenges both banks and centralized crypto platforms by promoting self-custody and direct participation. At its core, the issue is not banks versus crypto, but infrastructure versus middlemen. Centralized platforms attempt to replicate banking functions through custody, yield spreads, and controlled access. Decentralized systems reduce reliance on intermediaries by enabling peer-to-peer participation, transparent settlement, and direct ownership. Trump's attacks on the Federal Reserve resonate with this narrative as a rejection of concentrated financial gatekeeping. Political leaders opposing Trump have publicly defended the Federal Reserve's independence and argued against structural reform. Despite operating at significant financial losses, accountability mechanisms remain limited. Critics aligned with Trump emphasize accountability. Reports indicate the Federal Reserve is operating at losses exceeding $100 billion annually. Calls for greater scrutiny of leadership and decision-making continue to grow. From this perspective, Trump's broader narrative frames the Federal Reserve not as a neutral market referee, but as a controller of liquidity. Banks function as extensions of central policy, while debanking is viewed as a symptom of concentrated authority. The evidence suggests Trump is not merely criticizing the Federal Reserve as a symbol. He is confronting it as an institution he believes represents a structural imbalance between sovereignty and control. Whether one views this as disruptive populism or necessary reform, the direction is clear. The confrontation is structural, not symbolic, and the outcome will shape the future of financial governance. Before you watch the next clip, it's important to understand the context. This is not about slogans or shock value. It is about structure, power, and accountability. What you are about to hear reflects a growing argument that Donald Trump is not merely criticizing policy, but challenging the institutional role of the Federal Reserve itself. The perspective presented focuses on how monetary authority, banking access, and financial control have become concentrated within a narrow system that operates with limited accountability. Watch this clip not as a call to action, but as an explanation of how this debate is being framed, and why it is becoming increasingly difficult to ignore.
Here's where it gets really interesting, and why Trump's Fed comments are just as important as the exposure of the Obama plot against Trump. Trump and his economic team aren't just exposing the inner workings of a decades-long coup against him. They are preparing the American people for a huge economic fight. They're bringing you into a public and heated discussion about the very viability of the Federal Reserve. Listen to Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent.
I think that what we need to do is examine the entire Federal Reserve institution and whether they have been successful.
Now listen to Kevin Warsh's comments about the Fed. Warsh is being considered as a replacement for Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell whenever and however Powell's term ends. Here's what Warsh said about the Fed. We need regime change in the conduct of policy. But Warsh's other remarks are frankly even more interesting because he takes to task some hallowed Fed axioms. He said, the Fed seems to see every sign of economic growth as inflationary. That's not how it should be. Economic growth isn't inflation. Growth is how you solve these problems, not cause them. They think inflation comes if the economy runs too hot and workers get paid too much. That's not my view. And then you have Trump himself, who continues to call Powell a numbskull and drills down on the fact that the Fed's high interest rate policies make it impossible for young people to own a home. Put all of that together and you begin to see a concept arising of a different kind of banking system, one that supports a decent standard of living driven by the actual growth of the economy and not the demands of the empire of money. That was once widely known as the American system. Now, Judy Shelton, who was nominated for the Fed in Trump's first term but wasn't confirmed, tiptoed a little closer to the question of the constitutionality, or really the unconstitutionality of the Fed. She said, I don't think it is the role of the Fed to stand in judgment of the economic policies of an elected president. It violates the norms of democratic government to have the head of an agency who is so powerful they can't be fired. Now, in that same CNBC interview, she pointed out that the Fed has been paying hundreds of billions of dollars to private banks for parking cash reserves at the Fed rather than investing in the real economy. Think about that. They're literally paying banks not to invest in productive activity. And the question of productive activity and growing our way out of our deficit crisis and the need to have institutions that support that has become a driving theme of Trump and his allies. This is exactly what William McKinley understood over 120 years ago, that the financial system should serve the productive economy, not the other way around. Trump is bringing back the American system that built this country into an industrial powerhouse.
Before you watch this next clip, understand why it matters. This is not commentary from this channel, but a public statement made during a televised discussion about accountability at the highest levels of financial power. In this segment, Scott Bessent addresses concerns surrounding the Federal Reserve, including reported financial losses, leadership scrutiny, and the principle that no institution operates above oversight. This reflects a broader debate unfolding in the United States, one aligned with Donald Trump's position that central banking authority must be accountable, transparent, and subject to the rule of law. Watch this as primary source material. The statements speak for themselves.
The Federal Reserve occupies a unique spot in the American governmental process. They have no supervision, they have no accountability, and I think that we will look at this and think that a couple of things on Chair Powell's watch. The Fed is now losing $100 billion a year, $100 billion, with no accountability.
Yeah.
We had the worst inflation in 49 years, and we'll see what the tally ends up being, but
Got it.
very good chance that we will have had ethics violations over the past four to six of the regional presidents or governors, and there needs to be some accountability.
So it's an investigation. We'll leave it at that.
We inform, you choose. This channel does not publish false hope or sensational claims. The information shared here is grounded in observable policy, institutional structure, and documented financial mechanisms. If this breakdown helped clarify the issue, consider joining the JSARA for All community for ongoing research-based discussions and updates.